Greetings and durud. Welcome to today's edition of the Iranian Studies Initiative lectures in collaboration with the University of California, Santa Barbara. I am Alireza Ardekani of Farhang Foundation here in Los Angeles. We are a member-supported, non-political, non-religious, not-for-profit organization with a sole mission to celebrate and promote Iranian art and culture for the benefit of the global community. Today, we are very happy to welcome Dr. Farshad Sonboldel from the University of California, San Diego, for his talk on Mohammad Moqaddam, a prose poet introducing free verse into Persian poetry. This series is made possible with the support of the American Institute of Iranian Studies, the Persian Heritage Foundation, the California Humanities, and the Geramian Emrani Foundation. Please note that we will be holding a Q&A session at the end of today's talk. So please do submit your questions for Dr. Sonboldel via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Janet Afari, renowned author and the director of the Iranian Studies Initiative at the University of California, Santa Barbara.
Thank you very much, Alireza, and thanks to everyone at Farhang Foundation for their collaboration and help. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Farshad Sonboldel is the World History and Cultures Librarian at the University of California, San Diego. He earned his PhD in Modern Languages from the University of St. Andrews in UK after receiving his master's degree in Persian language and literature from the University of Tehran. In addition to his academic research background and publications in English, he's an award-winning poet and literary critic. Dr. Sonboldel has published 4 books in Persian. More recently, he published in English The Rebellion of Forms in Modern Persian Poetry, Poetics of Experimentation by Bloomsbury Academic, Politics of Poetic Experimentation by Bloomsbury Academic. He's the editor of Mela News, Journal of the Middle East Librarians Association. And Dr. Sonboldel is also the Bahari Fellow in the Persian Arts of the Book at Bodleian Libraries, University of Oxford. Thank you, Dr. Sonboldel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Ardekani and Professor Afari for having me, and thank you, Professor Afari, for the kind introduction. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to be here and share a part of actually my research with you today. What I'm going to present today is basically the presentation of a small part of one of the chapters of my recently published book, The Rebellion of Forms in Modern Persian Poetry. Well, before I start, actually, I would like to mention that this book actually, this research book goes beyond a regular research for me. It's also about my own journey as a poet, asking myself if what I write really matters. To find out, throughout the years, I delved into the works of past poets who challenged the norms in modern Persian poetry. Moqaddam is one of those poets, actually. I wanted to tell, excuse me, the story of poets who were often overlooked from a different perspective. So I went on a transformative journey. At the same time I was doing this research, I wrote a long poem, a verse essay, titled She'r Boland Sharayet, the long poem of consequences, if you want to translate it this way, which is a verse essay published in 2019. And I see that actually as a poetic representation of the ideas explored in this book. In the very first page of that poetry collection, poetry book, I quoted a stanza from Mohammad Moqaddam, as you see on the screen, and which was very inspiring for me because of the time it's been composed and the imagery, and I'll be talking about the Moqaddam's experimentations later in this talk, but I just wanted to read a part of شعر بلند شرایط, which was inspired by this stanza, actually, just to make this connection between these two books, actually, here. So, this is from the 5th chapter of the شعر بلند شرایط. من شاعری سادم که در خودش میپیچد، زانوی سر به رحل قال میکند که کتابم. کار ناشر تازه است که سر در میآورد از خشم و سر فرو میکند در چشم. من آن رضا براهنیم که ترانه های جهان را ریز نوشته و برده آن بالا و دارد میخواند، سینه میزند و میخواند و نفس میزند. من آن رضا براهنیم در ناله های آن روز صبح که ریش بلندی در آورده و ریش هایش ریختند و در نمی آیند. کتاب تازه من را اینطور شروع کن. من آن شاعر ساده‌ام که در خودش میپیچد. چراغ اول را تو روشن کن یار، شقیقم میان دو گلدسته به هوای ازان و ناشری در چشم و یک رضا براهنی در چشم دیگرم دارم. چراغ دوم را تو روشن کن یار و پیشانی مرا از بالای البرز بردار و دستی بر آن بزار. بگو همش همان بود که دیدی و نخواهی شنید و نشنیدی. من دیدم، من از درون دوتا بادگیر فضای داخل خانه را دیدم. اول تیزی تری بر بریدش سراند، بعد آبش دادم، بعد بالا را نگاه کرد، درست در چشمان من نگاه کرد و رضا براهنی را شناخت. پیشانیم را از آن بام برداشتم و 1000 بار پیشانیم از آن بام برداشته شد. Before discussing the main topic, let me briefly classify the pioneer poets of the first half of the 20th century to give you some context. The reconstruction of literary traditions during this era involved 3 main groups. The first group consisted of modernists whose followers could be categorized into 2 subgroups: modern poets advocating for gradual literary modernization and high modernists advocating for radical changes in classical poetics. The former group, influenced by Nima Yushij's early experiments with romantic themes, mostly centered around Afsane, sought to refine neoclassical templates, particularly Charpare, a hallmark of post-constitutional poets, to accommodate these themes. On the other hand, poets in later groups, inspired by Nima's later works post-1940, embraced literary modernism as an alternative to both classical and gradualist modern poetry. Traditional literary historians refer to these 2 subgroups as Charpare Sorayan, or four-liners, and Nimaic poets, respectively. The second group, which we will be focusing here today, comprised experimental artists who, though not directly challenging the literary mainstream, recognized the need for changing poetic structures. They experimented in various ways to foster a new understanding of poetic form and propose new styles to rejuvenate poetry for the new era. The most significant experimentalist poets of the 1930s to 1950s are Mohammad Moqaddam, we'll be discussing today, Zabih Behruz, and Shim Parto. The third major group consists of avant-garde poets advocating for the destruction of the dominant institutionalized literary traditions and the introduction of radical changes to poetic structures and aesthetics to foster new forms of creativity in general. The most influential figures of this trend were Tonder Kia and Houshang Irani, who have been actually studied in the last chapter of the book. In this talk, we are going to talk about Mohammad Moqaddam, as I mentioned, just a quick overview over his life and career. We actually will peel back the layers of his life and career to understand how he pushed the boundaries of the tradition of versification, basically. We will also explore Moqaddam's concept of free verse, examining the phrasal, rhythmical, and metrical techniques he actually employed in his poetry. Mohammad Moqaddam Bahman, born in Tehran in September 1908, embarked on a fascinating journey that took him from an American college in Tehran to the bustling streets of New York. Despite not completing his bachelor's degree in his first try, actually, he returned to Tehran in 1929, where he found himself translating for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a couple of years. And but it wasn't actually the end of his academic pursuit. In 1931, he made his way back to the States. He eventually found himself at Princeton University, chasing a PhD in Oriental culture and literature. During his studies as a PhD student, he published his first collection of poetry titled راز نیمه شب راهی چند بیرون از پرده in 1934. He actually composed all poems of this collection in a single night, after what he calls a thought-provoking conversation with a friend about the experimental means of expressing thought through Persian poetry. Shortly after, he printed a mere 150 copies of his second collection, titled Bang Khurus. He also, in May 1935, he published his final collection of poetry, which is a long poem, actually a long dramatic poem, titled Bazgasht Alamut, Pish Daromad va Name Yekum. And this about 40-page long poem was printed only in 40 copies, and has an imprint in its very first page saying that this is not for sale. So he had this ideal audience in mind, and he distributed his works only among those who he thought as the ideal addressees of this book, audience of this book. So he was not looking for a public recognition or anything at that time, at least. Following his graduation in 1938, Moqaddam returned to Iran at a pivotal moment when modernist poets were fervently actually advocating for their manifestos to define literary modernism. Despite the turbulence in Persian poetry at the time, Moqaddam displayed little interest in such upheavals. Instead, he embarked on his career as a lecturer in ancient Iranian languages at the University of Tehran. In the early 1960s, he ventured to the United States again, and he taught Iranian history and cultures at the University of Utah. Upon his return again to Iran in 1963, he actually played a pivotal role in establishing the departments of ancient languages at the University of Tehran, which is still functioning. Moqaddam, in general, left a lasting impact by introducing Iranians to prose poetry as it understood in word literature, the style that blended modern Persian prose with the Western forms of poetry called free verse or blank verse, although these two are different, but he actually experimented in both. And despite publishing 3 collections of poetry in 1934 and 1935, he refrained from releasing any further creative literary works thereafter. Nevertheless, his pioneering experiments in prose poetry and his daring use of unconventional poetic language significantly expanded the horizons of literary innovation during his era. critics generally agree on this assumption, basically, that Moqaddam's poetry exhibited a strong influence from American poetry, notably the works of Walt Whitman. And often his work often seen as a blind imitation of the Whitman's work. Mohammad Shafiq Kadkani actually is a leading literary critic who basically established this idea about Moqaddam's works and suggests that Moqaddam's poetic style might have also been shaped by the prose translations of Western poetry found in Iranian journals during the first half of the 20th century. These translations actually played a critical role through which multiple generations of Persian poets acquainted themselves with modern Western literature. However, there are important critics to this argument. Probably an important critic of this argument lies in its oversimplification of the innovative experiments of the poets who underwent linguistic and literary studies in the United States. Attending a prominent American university probably demanded a high level of English proficiency, suggesting that Moqaddam likely possessed the autonomy to evade direct influence from early Persian translations of Western poetry. Furthermore, it is essential to scrutinize the extent of Walt Whitman's impact on Moqaddam's poetry. Moqaddam himself suggests that if he were to acknowledge any connection between his work and a Western model, he would cite another American poet, Edna St. Vincent Millay, a poet closer to his age. Millay passed away in 1950. He basically sees her as a as a source of inspiration instead of Whitman. He at least claims so. But by a certain days, actually, this assertion by Moqaddam could be interpreted as an attempt of Moqaddam basically to redirect critics' attentions from the prominent figure of Whitman to a lesser-known contemporary American poet for Persian speakers, of course, to making a case for a more nuanced peer-to-peer dialogue rather than in unilateral influence. So this is something important to keep in mind. But another aspect shaping the evolution of Moqaddam's prose poetry was its dialogue with contemporary Persian prose. One could argue that Moqaddam's personal interest in linguistics, ancient languages, and modern literature found resonance in Persian fiction written between 1930s and 1950s, particularly in the works of Sadegh Hedayat, a close friend of Moqaddam. As you see in these pictures, they're played. Like some of his contemporaries, Moqaddam's poetic experiments actually lean towards archaic language, themes, and even literary forms, reflecting a broader convergence between poetry and prose in that particular era's literary landscape. The incorporation of Middle Persian vocabulary into the literary language of this period is notable. Many essayists and scholars attributed this phenomenon to what they term as purification movement, a try and attempt actually to basically replace word vocabulary from Middle Persian, or basically to coin new terms using the Middle Persian grammatical rules to replace those of Arabic, Turkic, and more recently French origin words in Persian language. Moqaddam had actually a very pivotal role in this movement through his linguistics work and academic actually career. It references to how he actually was engaged in this movement is present in my book, if anyone wants to review those. In terms of the themes, poetic themes, and literary themes generally during this period, there was a notable trend in several short stories, novels, and plays in this era that they were basically drew upon folk tales and historical narratives from the pre-Islamic or early Islamic era. Just to name a few, Hedayat play Parvin Dukhtar Sasan or Maziar, and which actually both set in ancient Iran. Additionally, a collection of short stories titled An Iran or Non-Iranian in 1931 by Shin Parto, another experimentalist poet of this era, Bozorg Alavi and Sadegh Hedayat. There are two other very noteworthy novels in this time, Shahrbanu in 1931 by Ali Asghar Rahimzadeh Safavi and Lazika by Haydar Ali Kamali, published in 1930, which both actually delved into narratives set in pre-Islamic Iran. So it was a common theme in that time, and it had actually several connections with what was going on in terms of politics and the politics of cultural activities at the time, which again were studied and mentioned in the book. I just don't want to get into it right now because we may get a little off topic. In his pursuit of an unconventional aesthetic, Moqaddam actually ventured into three distinct realms of Persian poetics: rhyme scheme, rhythmical system, and diction. We are going to focus on the rhyme scheme and rhythmical system here today, in which he actually sought to distance his poetry from the established tradition of versification. In terms of rhyme arrangements, Moqaddam's poetry often employs scattered patterns where rhymes occur both at the end and in the middle of verses. And just remember that these poems have been written before Nima's first attempts of his so-called Nimaic poetry in 1940. So he has actually ventured experimenting with rhyme schemes very before Nima. Unlike classical rhyme patterns, which follow a predetermined template, this freestyle approach disrupts the monotonous rhythm of the poem. Over time, the use of freestyle rhyme transformed the narrative structure of Persian poetry, lending unique voices to different elements within the poem. Moqaddam employs freestyle rhyme to craft a poem where various characters express themselves in a personalized voice. For example, in this stanza here on this slide, we can see that the semi-alternate recurrence of rhymes at the end and in the middle of hemistichs captures the playful and melodic voice of the bird. من مرغ شبابیزم روز پنهان و از روشنیش پرهیزم آشیانم کس ندیده هرگز تاریک چه شد بیرون پرم و خوانم. Moqaddam integrates both metrical and non-metrical stanzas in his poetry, resulting in compositions with diverse rhythms that accentuate different tones within a poem. Furthermore, he occasionally crafts stanzas featuring blended rhythmic systems where metrical and non-metrical hemistichs coexist. In these instances, whenever the overtone of the stanza is required, the poet adjusts the syntax with the meaning by changing the disposition of phrases and rhythmic arrangement. So to make it closer to the natural tone of the language, as Nima actually suggested and experimented with, of course, after afsane. In this example here, the narrator seamlessly merges the conventional prosodic meters, aruzi meters, of the first two lines into a blended meter to simulate the movement of the bird among the trees. در باغ‌های تنها در دره‌های پربین, they clearly have some sort of aruzi meter. بر شاخ درختان تکرو افراز درختان بلند پربرگ میپرم و میخوانم. In this example, the combination of the first two hemistichs forms a conventional prosodic meter named مضارع مسمن اخرب, which we don't want to delve into it, but however, despite this traditional rhythmic system, the metrical arrangement does not repeat in the hemistichs of all hemistichs of the stanza. One can consider the last hemistic as a non-metrical, since the pattern, although loosely resembling a kind of nursery rhyme, does not approximate any of the distinguishable metrical patterns in Persian poetry. So moving from prosodic lines to like at least non-prosodic but rhythmic lines in a single stanza is something that happened in Nemaic poetry years after that, especially in Farshad's poetry. But Moqaddam has experimented with this type of rhythmic arrangements in 1930s, which is fascinating and has been overlooked in the mainstream actually literary studies over the past decades. Another experiment Moqaddam undertakes with the traditional prosodic system is actually the inconsistent use of final metrical feats in uneven verses of a stanza. In this example from Razani Meshab again, the first two hemistichs represent a rather unconventional variation of the Hazaj meter, that's a traditional aruzi rhythmic system. However, the final fourth foot in the first and the second hemistic is scanned differently. So he changes slightly the fit during the stanza to basically dismantle the whole solidified system of aruzi meters. The third hemistic is shorter and corresponds to the first 3 feet in the preceding hemistic. Similarly, the last hemistic maintains a similar metrical arrangement to the third one, with a slight variation in the second foot. I know it's a little too detailed, but I just tried to show in this talk that how he very briefly showed that how he actually experimented with the aruzi system, which seemed actually impossible at the time. At least it was considered as a very, very unconventional move for a poet. So چون نیمه شب گشت یکی پروانه از دور بیامد برم و روشنیم خواست از روشنیم بال و پرش سوخت سوزی ز درون من برآورد. The technique of seamlessly integrating metrical and non-metrical or even prosaic lines is executed skillfully here, actually allows that the poet to demolish the dominance of rigid prosodic meters throughout the entirety of the poem. In traditional poetics, the prosodic meter is regarded as one of the fundamental elements of the poem. So that distinguishes actually poetry from prose. Therefore, the inclusion of non-metrical lines in a poem challenges the conventional significance of prosody, which is a huge, actually, move in that age. I don't want to go through the more examples of this sort, but let me make some other examples of how Moqaddam embarked on inventing metrical patterns that deviated from the strict standards of traditional prosody. However, even in these lines that you see on this slide, one can discern recurring prosodic fits. These lines in Moqaddam's poetry, and this is actually in spite of what was claimed usually in critics actually referring to Moqaddam's poetry, they basically denounced him for not knowing Persian prosody well, or just experimenting with something that he was not an expert of. But this shows that he actually knows prosodic meters, and he's experimenting with it from different angles to make something new. These lines in Moqaddam's poetry neither conform to a specific metrical fit, nor lack rhythm entirely, like a regular prose. Indeed, there is a rhythmic quality to the verses here, but they do not neatly align with the standard prosodic meters or Aruzi meters. Parviz Natel Khanlari describes rhythms of Moqaddam's poetry as, at best, a rhythmic-like beats, which, unlike conventional meters, does not adhere strictly to the quality and quantity of syllables or feet in each verse, but they have some sort of rhythm to it. And these poems with tones reminiscent to pre-Islamic poetic prayers actually may be another connection between Moqaddam's poetic experimentations and his studies and his research in ancient Iranian languages and literature, which may be called, like, we may term them as rhythmic prose at this time. اکنون نیمی ز شب تیره گذشته، نیمی ز تنم سوخته، مانده به جای نیم دگرش، یا سوخته گردد یا نه. After analyzing Moqaddam's techniques in crafting new rhyme and rhythmic patterns, one notices that the absence of a specific musical system in his poetry. Moqaddam himself acknowledges that he had no particular model in mind when breaking his lines. Rather, he cut the line where he felt it had reached a kind of rhythm, by avoiding adherence to any predefined musical meter. Moqaddam, like other pioneers of his time, underscores the importance of capturing the natural tone of a speech in a poem, which is actually very, very important, a very pivotal suggestion by Nima later, that actually changes the perspective of Persian poets towards the literary language. But Moqaddam actually has experimented with this years before that. It appears that Moqaddam was the first Persian poet to strive for a natural tone of speech within prose poetry, diverging from the conventions of traditional prosodic poetry. In doing so, he employs techniques that might be deemed language errors in conventional literary discourse. Moqaddam liberates his language from the constraints of a standard syntax in Persian, aiming to accentuate the natural rhythm of prose. In this example, he allows the speech to unfold expansively within the stanza through enjambments, which is not a technique that could be used in classical poetry because of the templates and poetic forms. Indeed, the stanza in this poem comprise several unfinished hemistichs in terms of syntax. Then he permits the meaning to flow seamlessly from one hemistich to another without completion. This technique enables the poet to synchronize the length of the hemistich with the natural cadence of the speech, rather than confining it within the restricted units of traditional versification. Moreover, the rhythm of the stanza is partly a result of overloading the sentences with complemental, prepositional phrases and relative clauses. I'm not going to read this section just to save some more time. But Moqaddam employs a technique of breaking each mystic into 2 or 3 segments by inserting pauses among phrasal groups and clauses. One could argue that this technique resembles a form of caesura, which denotes a pause between 2 phrases in a line of verse. This technique was had been seen actually in Walt Whitman's poetry, and it's been actually analyzed in Whitman's poetry as a way to divide the line into groups of various grammatical types. While the grammatical nature of these groups may vary, the underlying principle by which the line is divided by the caesura remains consistent. Whitman employs this technique for rhetorical emphasis, and the resulting group also possesses rhythmic or prosodic significance. This might be the point that Moqaddam actually has used this or has been in dialogue with the techniques used by American poets in free verse poetry, basically. I've been actually analyzing this a little further in the book, but I don't want to delve into it more here, as I have more examples here, especially to talk about a little bit about how these kind of rhythmic system allows Moqaddam to allow the personages and like the personas during the poem to have their own distinct voice. Moqaddam endeavors to establish a pattern of pauses by positioning them strategically within the sentences. Indeed, he harnesses the musicality inherent in prosodic lines by fragmenting them into smaller units that share rhythmic similarities. In some poems, the caesura disrupts the line unevenly to delineate distinct voices. For instance, in this poem called Atesh Nime Shab, Midnight Fire, the narrator composed demeanor is actually depicted through longer hemistics with fewer breaks, whereas recurring pauses signify an enthusiastic tone of the fire angel and fairies in the other section. So in this section, that's the narrator's actually section says آتش بلند می شود پاره‌های آن بالا می جهند چکیدن سرشک آتش و ناله آن شنیده می شود. Use of caesura actually makes the reader to read this section in a lower pace. But later in the second part of this example of here. I may miss a couple of slides. Yeah. So here you can see the Ferishte Azar, the fire angel, sings as no روشنیم تازه و گرمیم سوزان as no پریان با هم as no. The caesura actually makes you to read this in a different tone. Moqaddam's poetry actually exhibits a distinctive literary style that blends the naturalness of expository language with the prosaic energy of fictional prose, actually, in these sort of examples. Unlike conventional poetic works, Moqaddam's innovative language avoids the repetition and overused poetic words and expressions, and it transcends a mere insertion of colloquial elements into poem, basically these kind of poems. Instead, Moqaddam's poetry seamlessly transitions between literary and non-literary registers of Persian, expanding the boundaries of conventional literary language. This is something that you may see in the next example. Moqaddam actually incorporates diverse voices into this example, this part of Bazgesh Ba'alamut. in which actually each character has its own distinct voice and speaks in its own natural tone and language. The multiplicity of voices and heterogeneity among components of the literary language contributes to more democratic poetic form, actually democratic poetic structure. That's actually where Moqaddam's poetry, regardless of its content, becomes political, actually, or acts political. By utilizing the entire Persian lexicon, not just the conventional literary vocabulary, Moqaddam ensures that all voices in the poem have an equal opportunity to be heard and understood. So they all have their own language and bring them from their own the background. It's not the language of the poet dominant on the whole poem or this section especially. In the beginning of this section, you see آهسته حسن نزدیک شد، پشت خود را به درختی داد و خاموش ماتش برد. پس از لختی بنشست و خم شد تا چهره خود در آب شوید. چشمان خودش در آب او را گرفتند و چون در چشمان خود در آب مینگریست سرود پریان را شنید. وانسان سرودشان سبک و شیرین بود. وانسان سرودشان سبک و شیرین بود که حسن نزدیک بود بلغزد و در آب افتد. This is the section that the narrator actually narrates. So it has a very standard literary language and tone. But the fairies section, Surud Pariyan, has a distinct voice actually in language. پری روی نیلوفر، خدای دل علمود، خدای دژ علمود رو بنگرید، هوای کوه نمیخواد، خوراک و نوشاک خورده، بوی از دختر برده، دیگه تنهایی نمیخواد. پریان با هم، خدای دژ رو بنگر، شیفته شده به دختر، همچی که شد پس بهتر. و چون به اینجا رسید حسن دید که چشمانش آذرین گشته. In this section, the voice of the narrator maintains equal standing with other voices and does not impose its language on the fairies. This is in stark contrast to traditional poetry, where the narrator often elevates and suppresses hidden language of different classes and public transcript, conforming it into a highly esteemed poetic template, thereby neutralizing its impact and softening its tone. So that's where the politics of poetic experimentation actually in Moqaddam's work actually shows itself. However, in Moqaddam's poem, the narrator lacks dominant influence over the language of other characters. Fairies are free to express themselves in their own chosen language, resulting in a colloquial and rhythmic speech. By utilizing the entire Persian lexicon, Moqaddam allows all objects and characters, regardless of their status in the hierarchy of cultural values, to possess a distinct language through which they can manifest in the poem. Just to wrap this up, it's very crucial to recognize the experimental works like Moqaddam's, that they are not aimed to directly challenging traditions to propose a new aesthetic regime or literary style to the public. Instead, they seek to expand the boundaries of the genre and pave the way for modernization among avant-garde poets and high modernists. Moqaddam's most significant influence, therefore, lies in the poetry of the subsequent generations. With the groundwork laid, the following generation, alongside some poets from Moqaddam's own era, like Shin Parto and Zabih Behruz, were able to erect a new structure within the space that Moqaddam, as an experimentalist, had created by dismantling the older structures. Thus, the innovations evident in Moqaddam's work represent experiments with the potential of Persian poetry. These experiments culminated in the works of the next generation of high modernist poets, such as Ahmad Shamlu, particularly Ahmad Shamlu and his followers of prose poetry, or Sher Sepid as it's been termed, or the proponents of avant-garde movements, such as Sher Digar and Moj No in the 1960s. So yeah, I'm going to end this here. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. I actually had the good fortune of being able to read your whole book, and which I found absolutely fascinating. And I was trying to ask you perhaps a few broad questions about what you try to do in this work, right? So it seems to me one of the things you're trying to say is that a political act is not necessarily writing about the politics of the day, but the very experimentation that these generation of poets do with forms of poetry as well as content, that in and of itself has to be seen as a very important political act. Another thing which you seem to be saying is that as Iranian poets encounter modernity, so for example, new ways of thinking about themselves, about the world, about technology, for example, the initial process seems to be trying to incorporate these new ideas and these new ways of looking at the world, at the self, into more orthodox forms of poetry, or at least gradually and minimally trying to change that. And so that's kind of what we see in the works of De Khoda, for example, or Iraj Mirza. But there comes a point in Persian poetry where the form itself becomes a sort of straitjacket imposed on the poet. That is, the form itself makes it impossible to talk about these very, very new ideas. And we start to see this gradual experimentation, not just in content, a little bit with form, but then gradually more and more, right? And so it seems to me that you place Mohammad Moqaddam in a very crucial point in this history, even though his work was not available to the general public, certainly was circulating among poets of his own generation, right?
Yes.
And the other thing that you seem to be saying as this kind of experimentation, as I look at your work, seems to have one leg in the forms that are not commonly respectable forms, right? So they could be popular forms, they could be Rozakhani or could be Takht Hozi, for example, kinds of satirical performative ones that were around, but they were not considered respectable forms, right? And then, or they were just simply not accessible. For example, works from Iran Bostan, for example. And then on the other hand, they seem to have one foot in, modern experimentations that are done among non-Iranians. So for example, I think you talked about Walt Whitman with regard to here, Mohammad Moqaddam. But we also kind of see that with Bahman Muhassis, perhaps, when he experiments with Picasso, with Italian painters. And that's where it seems to be like the public seems to really have an aversion to this break with form when it comes to this. That's where you seem to be seeing a lot of reaction. The concept of Jiq Banafsh, which of course has so many antecedents in modern poetry, for example, modern Western poetry. And so kind of where is Mohammad Moqaddam? If you could just say a little bit more about the way he tries to accomplish this in terms of, both going back to Persian, Iranian, inaccessible forms, and then also maybe from his contemporaries in the non-Iranian society.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's actually like just to mention quickly regarding the first part of your comment and question. Yes, I agree that what this book actually tries to do is to somehow redefine the politics of literature and pose it somehow alongside the political literature as in a reflection of the political events outside in the real world. The politics of literature by itself can be a political act by the poet as they change the form, they dismantle the old poetic forms which are the representations of the hierarchical political regimes outside the literature. So yet I totally agree, and yet this is the way that I try to go and put all these poets studied in this book actually in that position and examine their works in with this regard. But as for the where Moqaddam stands actually here, and like all different aspects of his poetic experimentation, yes, well, he has this access to ancient languages and literature probably, and he's very much influenced by the tone and overtone of this kind of literature, especially the Avestai prayers. You can see that in his poetry, that how he was influenced by the rhythm of these kind of prayers and orations, and sometimes even the content is very prayer-like. Especially in the first collection, Razanime Shah. But it seems like that Moqaddam wants to, actually, he tries to find a form to express his own feeling, basically, and his own unique experience in the world as an Iranian studying in the United States at the time, but studying actually ancient Iranian languages, so still have those connections. And him actually moving back and forth between Iran and in the United States, trying to establish something in Iran, going back, learn, and again coming back. He tries to find a form, a poetic form, which can carry actually these experiences. And he cannot find it in traditional poetic forms. And it's important to remember that at this point, the most radical poetic experiments that had happened in the history of Persian poetry was what we experienced during the Constitutional Revolution. That was the huge change that happened in Persian poetry. So nothing specifically in nothing radical in form, but there were a lot of new contents actually coming into the Persian poetry and being experimented. So Moqaddam tries to find a way to basically integrate these two parts of his own personality and his actually knowledge. And so he tries to understand free verse and blank verse in a way to recreate something like that in Persian poetry. It's not like that he has adopted that poetic forms into Persian poetry and just localized it. He had tried to start from prosodic meters in Persian poetry, as I showed in the presentation. He tried to experiment with Aruzi poetry, basically, and move it towards blank verse and free verse somehow. And I consider this as the political act of Moqaddam's poetry. And this is why he is a pivotal figure in this era. He basically opens up a path for next generations to be more revolutionary in terms of changing the solidified structures of Persian literature as a whole, especially the avant-gardes coming after, right after that, in the next generation. Without his experimentations, they didn't have the space actually to somehow embark upon radical changes in Persian literature. So that's both literary and political in his work.
Let me ask you some of the questions that have come. Moqaddam seems to me, the first two I think are similar. Moqaddam seems to be a pioneering poet in the Persian language. What may have been the reason for this lack of popularity? Was it his style in particular? Was it too avant-garde for Persian speakers? And the second one, thank you for introducing us to this great poet. Where can we find books on Moqaddam? Is this work published? So if you can answer maybe those two questions, and then I'll go to and then another one also. Why do you think Moqaddam is not better known as one of the great poets of Iran? How did he compare to his contemporaries of the time? So if you can answer this, and then I'll go to the next question.
Sure. Let me answer the one about the book first because it's shorter. Yes, the book is published by Bloomsbury Academic, and the Moqaddam's work is studied in the 5th chapter of the book, and it's available online. The Rebellion of the Forms in Modern Persian Poetry. You can buy it on Amazon or the publisher's website directly. Thank you for asking that. So about why Moqaddam's poetry was not popular at the time, it's actually it's a great question. Usually what is I don't want to say like ahead of the time, but something that does not conform to the established structures and established cultural cultural regime of values are usually rejected throughout the history. And Professor Karimi Haqqaq actually in his exceptional work recasting Persian poetry mentions that as these kind of works are considered as cultural noise because they do not conform with the present structure, they do not get the proper reception. But the thing is that these works, what I try to add to this discussion is that these works are not created to receive to be actually received by the public as like other more successful works did. They are actually created to move something forward within the structure of literary modernization. So they are created and being presented to the poets, basically. I think I mentioned that Moqaddam's books were published, and the first two were published into 150 copies only, and the last one in only 40 copies. And they were not for sale. So he just handed out these copies to those who he considered as readers. So they are aimed actually to change the perception of poetic change, poetic revolution, as we call it. And they were not actually aiming a public reception. But in general, these type of works actually do not receive that much of attention because at the time, they are trying to push the boundaries and they are trying to basically demolish what we believe in, what we consider as valuable, as beautiful. And at the moment, this is not something that the general public accepts. But later, when those ideas, when those regimes of values change, the next generations will appreciate those works and may find them beautiful. So a bad poetry can become actually a good poetry in the next generation, at least important poetry in the next generations.
Wonderful. I think we have perhaps time for one last question here. Was Mohammad Moqaddam's return to Alamut poems influenced by the book The Lord of Alamut, or did both literary places happen around the same time?
Not necessarily that book, like the Khodai Alamut, if you're referring to that. But the main character is Hassan Sabbah again. But Moqaddam has this tendency to Iranicize or Persianize the historical names. He even spells his own name as Mohammad Moqaddam. And he claims that this is not Moqaddam. Moqaddam is like the continuation of Moqs, like Zoroastrian clergies. So in this book, Hassan is spelled with He do Cheshm. So it's a different
ask you that question, actually.
Yeah, he's trying to actually somehow distance himself from the historical character of Hassan Sabbah and make it some kind of a mystical creature, but being created within that specific poem. So Hassan Sabbah in this poem actually falls in love, and this is a kind of like it's a non-human, semi-human something creature. So it's not Hassan Sabbah, but it has some kind of relations with that character.
Very nice. Thank you so much. This was a wonderfully, wonderfully rich talk. Appreciate your.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the comments and questions.
Thank you both. Thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Sonboldel, for joining us today and for sharing this insightful presentation on Mohammad Moqaddam and for introducing us to one of Iran's forgotten poets. And special thanks to Dr. Janet Afari and the entire team at UC Santa Barbara for organizing this annual lecture series with Farhang Foundation. As always, please visit farhang.org for all our latest upcoming events, talks, and programs. We thank you all for joining us from across the globe for today's talk, and we look forward to welcoming you next time. Until then, we bid you farewell. Have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.